amazing opportunity to travel to Paris and learn about psychology and culture and creativity. And then I also got to see a bunch of cool places and meet a bunch of cool people. And overall, it was an amazing opportunity that I'm so glad I had. But before the course, I thought about creativity the way most people do. I thought about it in the form of artwork, I thought about it in the form of movies, I thought about it in the form of statues, music, that sort of thing. And that was pretty much if you were able to do those, then you were creative. However, after the trip, my definition of creativity has changed. I realized that although all that stuff is involved in creativity, a large part of creativity is about you and your everyday decisions as well, like problem solving and things like that. And on my trip to Paris, I noticed a bunch of examples of creativity all around me. One of these examples is about the architecture in Paris. For example, the building of the Eiffel Tower. This was a great endeavor because the Eiffel Tower was the largest structure at the time. The second largest structure was the Washington Monument, and it about doubled the size of that. So, in order to make the Eiffel Tower, a bunch of things had to be thought through, like the shape of the tower was designed to reflect wind, and they had to invent new techniques to building because, as I mentioned, no one had built a structure like this before. There's also creativity in the architecture of Notre Dame. For there's like statues on the outside of the building. The way it's designed was beautiful, and the way it was renovated after it was burned down recently is all amazing. And inside Notre Dame, actually, the statues in there were also served a creative purpose because when it was built, a lot of people didn't know how to read, so they weren't able to experience these important stories in the Bible. So these statues were able to show these people these stories so that they could better get a grasp on them. Another thing I thought was creative was the style of the city. A lot of it was down to the history, but in Paris, a lot of the buildings can only be a certain height. The area where it's all busy is mainly the small things, and all the skyscrapers and stuff are on the outside of the city, which is the opposite of what you usually get, like in Phoenix, where downtown is the area with all the skyscrapers, and then the buildings tend to get smaller as they go further out. Along the same lines as the architecture, we were able to go to Monet's garden. And this was an area where Monet himself decided which plant should go where, how it was all set up, and all the things around. And the way he designed it was beautiful, and it allowed me to just calm down, inspired creativity, which is a great contrast to the Palace of Versailles, where they did have their own garden, but the way it was designed was much more uniform. The way that it was thought of was that this would be a great place to go to at parties, but that was pretty much the extent of our thoughts when we went there. Contrast between Monet's garden, which was creative, lush everywhere, versus the uniformity of the Palace of Versailles. This was something apparent in the architecture of these two places. As previously mentioned, artwork is an important part of creativity, and we saw a lot of it when we were there. Before we had any class outings, me and a couple of students, we decided to go to the Picasso Museum. And Picasso is an interesting figure when it talks about art because a lot of people, myself included, they typically see Picasso as like a crazy guy. They don't understand his artwork. It's just a bunch of shapes that just some guy was putting together and it vaguely looks like something. However, this isn't the case with everyone, and everyone has their own creative interpretations of art, and the way the art is done is creative. So, although it's not popular, that doesn't mean it's not special or unique. When we were in Paris, we also went to the Louvre, which is one of the most famous museums in the world. Here, we mainly were in the section about the Renaissance, which had the stuff like Mona Lisa and all of that. And this was a place where we saw a bunch from the Renaissance, but we also saw a bunch from other places. Like, I was able to go over to the Egyptian section. Unlike paintings, which they had in the Renaissance section, they Egyptians focused more on like statues, tablets, and sarcophaguses. To me, it is interesting how in these different places, art changes as well. This was also apparent when we went to the Greek section because the Greeks tend to focus more on statues. They tended to focus more on pots, which was something I thought was interesting, which have a functional use. And this was also greatly different from the Egyptian and Renaissance sections. Another thing about the trip that I thought was creative was afterwards, everyone was sending in their photos in the group chat, and I noticed that everyone there had their own style of photos. The people that I think best highlight this would be me, Charlotte, and Josiah. Me, I like to, when I take photos, I like to focus on the layout of the land, I like to focus on the environment and things like that. So I don't really choose to focus on people. So, and this is very apparent in the photos that I took in Paris. This is very different from Charlotte. I noticed in her photos, she chose to highlight like the little things while I focus on the big things. Like she would take pictures of signs on the street, she would take pictures of graffiti that we would pass every day. The little things that you don't typically think of when you travel, but are important to your trip. And then Josiah, he brought a professional camera, and then you could see that in his photos. You could see the professionalism in there. He was able to pose people so that they looked amazing. And what I noticed that he did a lot was that he posed people, took photos from behind them so that they were the forefront of the photo, and then stuff like the Eiffel Tower or Notre Dame, those are in the background. So I thought it was interesting how the way, although we're all seeing the same things, we all choose to highlight it very differently. Then, as I previously mentioned, creativity is also about the everyday things and how we solve problems. And we did run into a couple of problems while we were in Paris. First, we're Americans. We speak English. Most of us do not know any French. So we had to be creative in our solutions to solve the language barrier with people. And we also had to be creative in like being able to read like menus and street signs and stuff like that. For the menus and such, I would often take photos of what I wanted to do and then use the translating feature on the phone in order to figure out what was being said or what's on the menu, so I'm just able to understand it. And then also the issue of public transportation. Because we're Americans, and specifically most of us are from Arizona, we have very little public transportation. This for a lot of us, this is our first time experiencing it. So being able to understand it and being able to go through it together as a group, that took a lot of creativity from us. And then while we were in Paris, there was a massive heat wave that hit. We're able to deal with the heat wave, also required creative solutions. A couple of people bought fans and they would freeze towels and put on the back of the fans so that they were blowing cold air and able to keep themselves cool. And then some people weren't able to get fans, so what they did is they also had towels and had them frozen, but they would put them over their chest or their neck in order to cool their whole body down. Me personally, I would often, if I was in the dorms, hang out in the basement because the heat would not get there as badly, so it was much more comfortable to just be able to relax in there. Although issues like these are often personal, there's also problems that happen within the city itself. For example, the Eiffel Tower was only supposed to be there for a couple of years after the World Fair. But Eiffel, this was his crowning jewel, and he wanted to make sure it was there to stay. So, in order to make sure the Eiffel Tower didn't get taken down, he gave it other uses. An example of this is how it became a radio tower during World War I, so that it was able to better communicate with people during World War I, and it was an essential part of being able to take down the Germans. And another problem that the French had was the monarchy. So, and the way that they solved this was by executing the monarchy. The way that they did it was amazing. They went there to protest bread because they needed bread to survive, and they ended up killing the monarchs and beheading them in the streets where anyone could see. And I feel like that was an important issue in Paris that they were able to solve. Overall, I really enjoyed my trip to Paris. I am so happy that I got to meet so many amazing people and got to go to so many amazing places and got to learn about creativity and how it's impacted by culture.